The story begins not with hunger, but with laughter. In the autumn of 1943, a transport of German prisoners of war was unloaded in the American Midwest, their boots crunching across gravel as curious townspeople watched. These were men hardened by years of combat, their faces drawn from rations of black bread, watery soup, and ersatz coffee. Yet when rumors reached them that they might be marched past the so-called American market, the reaction was not awe, but mockery. One officer, his uniform still bearing the faded insignia of the Afrika Korps, smirked as he spoke to his comrades. In Germany, even a farmer's stall offers sausages. Here, I imagine it is nothing but corn and thin milk. The others chuckled, their laughter carrying across the line of guards. In their minds, America was a land of excess, but without refinement. A place of crude food where people ate to fill the stomach, not to savor. For men who boasted of Berlin bakeries with sugared pastries, Munich beer halls echoing with music, and Viennese cafes where soldiers once courted young women. The idea of a market in America seemed laughably provincial. That laughter, however, carried with it a deep arrogance born of desperation. Behind the smiles were bodies weakened by scarcity. Back in Germany, meat rations had been reduced to as little as 250 grams per week by late 1942. Mothers queued for hours for butter that rarely appeared. Children picked potato skins from refuse heaps, fighting over scraps. Yet these men clung to the myth that Europe's culture, its sausages, breads, and beers stood taller than anything Americans could offer. The guards, most of them young farm boys drafted from Iowa and Kansas, overheard the sneers but said nothing. They simply marched the prisoners onward. A few townspeople lining the street gave sharp looks, for they knew what the POWs were about to witness. The irony was that the laughter itself became the perfect opening act. It framed the men as proud, certain, unshakable in their belief that America's plenty was an illusion. They expected empty stalls, or at best a few baskets of corn and jugs of pale milk. They were sure that what they would see next could never compare to the refined image of European food markets. But history thrives on reversals. What awaited them just beyond the next corner was not a shabby display, but a vision that would silence even the boldest tongue. The audience of this story, you, listening now, are invited to picture the moment before the curtain is pulled back, when mockery hangs in the air like smoke, seconds before the wind clears it away. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as always, share your location and the time where you are watching, so we know where these echoes of the past continue to resonate today. The laughter of the prisoners echoed in their own ears as they marched on, but beneath it lay something deeper: pride. Pride in what they believed to be the superior traditions of Europe. Pride in a heritage they thought the Americans could never match. For the men of the Wehrmacht, food was more than sustenance. It was culture, proof of refinement, a reflection of centuries of brewing, baking, and butchering that shaped German identity. They spoke with longing of Berlin bakeries, where even in wartime one could smell the faint sweetness of streusel when flour was available. They remembered Munich beer halls, cavernous spaces filled with the hum of voices, brass bands, and the taste of barley brewed according to laws centuries old. Some mentioned Viennese cafes, elegant rooms with marble-topped tables, where a soldier might once sip coffee and imagine himself part of an unbroken tradition of sophistication. For them, food was civilization itself, and by that measure they were convinced the Americans stood outside the gates. The caricature they carried of America was one of crude meals, endless corn, sugary pies, overboiled coffee, and mass-produced tins. They eat to fill their stomachs, one soldier scoffed, while we eat to remember who we are. This arrogance, though, was sharpened by insecurity, deep down. Each man knew how thin the rations had grown at home. By 1943, German civilians received only 1,500 calories per day, a starvation diet compared to pre-war abundance. The sausages they boasted about had long since given way to scraps stretched with fillers. Even beer, their cultural symbol, was often watered down until it barely deserved the name. Yet their pride was a shield, a way of holding on to dignity in the face of defeat. Among themselves, they told jokes about America's supposed lack of taste. They whispered gossip that U.S. soldiers were fat because all they ate was cornbread and milk. An older sergeant laughed, claiming he had read that American women fried everything in grease because they had no idea how to cook properly. These jibes were a kind of comfort. A reminder that even in chains, they belonged to a nation that produced Goethe, Beethoven, and sausages worth remembering. But as they neared the edge of the town, the guards' silence unsettled them. No one laughed back, no one argued. The Americans did not defend their land with words. They simply led the prisoners toward the market square, behind the pride and the gossip. Unease began to creep in. Pride is loud until confronted with reality. The moment was building towards something more than food. It was about to become a collision between myth and fact, between the self-image of a people and the undeniable evidence of a world larger, richer, and more powerful than they had been told. The first sight of the American market struck like a blow, expecting mud and disorder. The German POWs instead stepped into brightness. It was a crisp morning in 1943, the sunlight cutting through the wide windows of a Midwestern market hall. The building itself gleamed, polished floors reflecting the bustle of shoppers, the air alive with scents that seemed almost impossible during war. Their eyes widened as the scene unfolded. Stalls stretched farther than they could count, each one heavy with food. Red cuts of beef lay in neat rows, marbled and glistening. Baskets of vegetables rose in pyramids of green, orange, and yellow, still damp with dew from morning fields. Apples and peaches, polished like ornaments, caught the light, their fragrance drifting across the aisles. Crates of fish, laid on ice, shimmered with silver scales as if they had just been pulled from the ocean, and bottles of milk, so white they seemed to glow, lined up in straight ranks like soldiers of plenty. For a moment, no one spoke. The laughter from before evaporated into stunned silence. One prisoner, no more than 20, whispered to himself in disbelief, "This, during war." His voice trembled, as if he were afraid the scene might vanish if he acknowledged it too loudly. The guards did not boast. They simply stood by as the Germans absorbed the sight. Housewives moved among the stalls, their children tugging at their skirts, pointing to sweets wrapped in colored paper. Shopkeepers greeted customers with easy smiles, weighing meat, slicing cheese, and bagging fruit without hurry. It was not staged for propaganda, not an exhibition to impress foreigners, but an ordinary day. And therein lay the shock. For these men, raised on the myth of a starving America propped up by illusion, the reality was a kind of betrayal. They had believed that the Reich was fighting against a soft, disorganized nation, a people too indulgent to withstand hardship. Yet here, in the heart of wartime, was a market that outshone anything they had seen even in the best days of Berlin. One officer clenched his jaw, his arrogance faltering. Another stared too long at a stall where cheeses of every shape and size were stacked high, their aroma teasing a stomach that had known only watery broth. A sergeant muttered bitterly, "Our families at home line up for scraps, and here milk stands untouched, waiting for anyone to take." This moment, though brief, broke something fragile inside them. It was not yet despair, but the first crack in certainty. The recognition that what they had been told of America bore no resemblance to what stood before them. The brightness of that hall cut deeper than any weapon. The silence of the prisoners deepened as they saw what came next. It was not merely abundance that confronted them, but a kind of excess beyond comprehension. The stalls were already full, every counter stacked with produce, meat, and bread. Yet trucks continued to arrive at the loading bay. Drivers in overalls shouted instructions as crates of oranges, boxes of butter, and sacks of flour were carried inside and added to mountains that seemed to have no end. One young prisoner, formerly a baker's apprentice from Hamburg, felt a knot tighten in his chest, in his hometown. Ration cards for bread had been cut so sharply that even bakers themselves went hungry, forced to stretch flour with sawdust and acorn powder. He remembered children coming to the bakery door, their hands reaching for crusts that never came. Now he watched as a crate of fresh loaves was set down, golden and steaming, not rationed, but sold openly to anyone with a coin in hand. His lips parted, but no words came. Another POW, an older sergeant from Cologne, muttered under his breath, "At home, our children fight over potato peels, and here they build mountains of food." His voice carried a bitterness that quieted those around him. No one dared laugh anymore. The scale was crushing. By 1943, U.S. farms were producing more than 350 million bushels of wheat per year, enough to feed their nation and still ship thousands of tons overseas to allies. American dairies poured out over 100 billion pounds of milk annually, while German families back home diluted theirs with water to make it last. The figures were invisible on paper, but here they were made flesh stalls so crowded they seemed to groan under the weight of plenty. Truck after truck rolling in as if the harvest would never end. And still, the Americans behaved as if nothing remarkable was happening. A farmer in denim unloaded crates while whistling a tune. A teenage boy stacked apples into neat rows, occasionally tossing one into the air before catching it again, carefree in a way that made the prisoners ache to the POWs. The sight was an insult wrapped in generosity. America had so much food it could afford to treat it casually, while their own families starved under the weight of total war. Some tried to rationalize it. "Perhaps this is just for show," one officer said, but his words carried no conviction. The sheer flood of goods crushed the explanation. There was no way to fake the steady stream of trucks, the chatter of customers, the smell of food so real it turned their stomachs inside out. In that moment, the prisoners realized they were not simply witnessing a market. They were standing inside the machinery of a nation whose resources dwarfed their own, whose capacity for feeding millions was as devastating as its tanks and planes. For the first time, doubt seeped into their certainty of German victory. The most painful blow was not the overflowing stalls, but the indifference with which Americans treated them. For the POWs, every basket of fruit and every loaf of bread felt like a miracle. For the shoppers, it was routine. Housewives walked calmly down the aisles, their skirts brushing against baskets stacked with oranges and grapes. A mother handed a child a stick of candy as casually as if she were passing a pebble. A farmer's wife bought a sack of flour and a jar of honey without even glancing at the shelves, confident that the same would be there tomorrow, and the day after that. The Germans watched in silence, their pride curdling into something heavier. They remembered Germany's endless queues, women standing in the snow with ration cards clutched tight, hoping to claim half a pound of butter that might not arrive. They remembered children with hollow faces licking bowls of thin soup. Yet here in America, people behaved as though food were as certain as the sunrise. The contrast was unbearable. One prisoner, a school teacher from Dresden before the war, found himself staring at a boy tugging his mother's sleeve, asking for fresh peaches. The mother sighed and nodded, handing him two. The boy bit into the first, juice running down his chin, then casually tossed the pit aside. The German clenched his fists. In his home city, he had seen children fight over orange peels. To see a boy treat such luxury as nothing left him shaken. The guards still said nothing, but their silence grew heavier. For the POWs, this indifference was more humiliating than mockery. It meant the Americans did not even consider abundance remarkable. They had so much that even prisoners of war, fed decently in camps, were no threat to their supply. The thought burned. A few prisoners whispered among themselves, trying to explain it. Some said it was unfair that America's land was too vast, its farms too rich. Others suggested that this was the true weapon of the United States, not tanks or bombers, but its ability to feed its people without fear. The gossip spread like sparks. One man joked bitterly that if Americans fought with bread loaves, Germany would have surrendered already. Another fell quiet, staring at the overflowing baskets, his face unreadable. What lingered most, though, was the sense of normality. For Americans, plenty was ordinary. For Germans, plenty had become a dream. That realization was devastating. And for you listening now, I want to ask, can you imagine standing in front of abundance, yet feeling it pierce your soul like a weapon? If you had been one of those men, watching children eat what your homeland could no longer provide, what would you have felt? Anger, envy, despair, or something else? Share your thoughts below, because these questions echo long after history has passed. By now, the air of pride that had carried the Germans into town had evaporated. No one laughed, no one sneered. The arrogance of European cuisine, the jokes about corn and watery milk, all of it had been silenced by the sheer weight of reality. Rows of food still stretched out before them, but what remained was not shock alone. It was humiliation. A lieutenant who had once bragged about his father's butcher shop in Bremen lowered his eyes. He whispered, almost to himself. Our Reich has thrown every ounce of strength into this war, and still our families go hungry. And here, they have enough to feed even us, their enemies. His words fell heavy, a confession carried by the very air, and those near him felt the sting of truth. What they witnessed was more than food. It was a mirror reflecting the collapse of their illusions. In Germany, propaganda posters promised that the fatherland was strong, that sacrifices were shared equally, that victory would bring prosperity. Yet in this market square of an American town, the truth was laid bare. America had resources so vast that war had barely dented its supply. The numbers, if they had known them, would have only deepened the despair. By 1944, the United States was producing more than 130 million tons of grain, 23 billion pounds of beef, and tens of billions of eggs. Entire fleets of refrigerated trains carried food across the continent daily. In Germany, by contrast, rations for civilians had shrunk to 1,200 calories per day. The Wehrmacht fought on empty stomachs, while American families still drank milk by the gallon and discarded leftovers without thought. The officers, once proud, could no longer meet each other's eyes. Some turned away from the stalls, ashamed not of capture but of realization. Others stood rigid, clenching their jaws as if to keep despair from showing. A young corporal muttered a prayer under his breath, the same words his wife had written in her last letter, "God keep the children from hunger," among the prisoners. The gossip stopped. The jokes had dried into silence. In their place grew a gnawing thought: if this was what America had in its small-town markets, what hope did Germany have of winning? Their nation had mobilized everything, drained every resource, yet still fell short. America, even while fighting across two oceans, had abundance to spare. This was the true turning point for many of them. Not the battles lost in Africa, not the bombings over Hamburg, but the quiet humiliation of watching a mother buy butter without fear. Pride collapsed in that moment, replaced by the recognition that their world was smaller than they had believed. And for you, the listener, what do you think breaks a man faster, the sound of enemy guns, or the sight of children eating freely while your own starve? Tell me in the comments. Because history is not just written in victories, but in the silences where pride finally gives way. Years passed, the war ended, but the memory of that day in the American market lingered like a wound that never healed for many former POWs. The most haunting image of captivity was not barbed wire or guard towers, but the stalls of food they once mocked and then beheld in stunned silence. In post-war Germany, when veterans gathered in taverns or spoke to their children, the subject returned with surprising frequency. One old soldier, now a factory worker in Stuttgart, told his grandson, "I once laughed at the thought of American markets. I thought they were filled with corn and thin milk. Then I stood before endless stalls, brighter than any dream, and I understood why we lost." His grandson, born into a divided Germany of ration cards and rebuilding, listened with wide eyes. Others wrote in letters never sent, diaries hidden in drawers until discovered decades later. A corporal confessed that his faith in the Reich shattered not on the battlefield, but in front of a cheese counter in Iowa. "I thought we were fighting equals," he wrote, "but we were fighting giants who fed their people as though war did not exist." The diary was small, bound in black cloth, and when uncovered by his family in the 1970s, it still smelled faintly of the barracks where it had been hidden. These recollections reveal something profound. War is fought with weapons, but remembered in details. For these men, a loaf of bread on a shelf, a child biting into a peach, a woman buying butter without worry, these became the symbols of defeat. They were not just reminders of what America possessed, but of what Germany could never achieve under tyranny and scarcity. The symbolic power of that market hall grew over the years. To some, it became a story of humiliation, the moment their pride collapsed. To others, it was strangely hopeful proof that the world could be abundant, that humanity might live without fear of hunger. Yet for all, it was unforgettable. Imagine it yourself after years of war, after propaganda and hunger, to stand before aisles of food so vast they seemed to stretch into eternity. Would you laugh, weep, or simply fall silent? That was the question each man carried for the rest of his life, and the final image remains. Sunlight spilling across a market square, Stalls groaning with fruit, bread, meat, and milk. The chatter of ordinary shoppers, moving without fear, for German prisoners of war. That picture burned brighter than any battlefield, a symbol of strength and humanity that outlived the war itself. The story of the German prisoners and the American markets does not end in the moment of shock. It lingers, like the aftertaste of something too powerful to forget. For those men, the sight of abundance was more than humiliation. It was revelation. They had been raised in a world where propaganda painted their enemies as decadent and weak. Yet what they saw was strength measured not only in weapons, but in bread, milk, and fruit piled high. The market was not simply a place of commerce. It was proof of a society that could wage war and still feed its children, still live without fear of hunger. Decades later, some of those same men would confess that no battle, no surrender, no bombardment haunted them as much as that morning in the market. The images returned in dreams, the silver of fish on ice, the glow of milk bottles lined like sentinels, the carefree laugh of a child biting into a peach, for a people whose families had queued in cold streets for scraps. These details cut deeper than the sound of enemy guns. They revealed a truth that wars are not only decided on battlefields, but in fields of wheat, in factories, and in markets where life continues. History often remembers the tanks, the strategies, the speeches of generals. Yet here, in a quiet American town, the true weight of power revealed itself in the ordinary. The stalls of food became a mirror, reflecting not only the weakness of the Reich, but also the endurance of a system built on abundance. And perhaps the lesson still matters today. Strength lies not only in force, but in the ability to nourish, to provide, to make plenty seem ordinary.